My name is Leeann Carey, and I'm from Southern California, the beach cities, Redondo Beach. My yoga story is very interesting, at least I think it is. I was introduced to yoga when I was about 17 years old. I was visiting my brother, who was in college at the time at Berkeley, and I happened to go on a walk one day, and while I was walking down the street, I saw a sign in the front of a really cool-looking house. I heard a lot of music coming from the house, and it said free dinner. So I thought, that sounds great to me. What do I have to do? And I didn't have to do anything. I walked in and I heard the music and I saw the people playing all different kinds of instruments that I'd never seen before, actually. Turned out to be an ashram, and I had dinner that night with a bunch of yogis that I had never met before. So I was introduced to yoga, really pretty much pranayama and meditation, sort of on my own after that. I was like, what is this all about? And I started getting interested in Yogananda Paramahansa. And so I became pretty interested in SRF, which is Self-Realization Foundation. And I was getting all these newsletters, and I was still a high school student, so my mom was like, oh my God, what is happening here? Who is she becoming? I was getting all these interesting newsletters about divine light and divine self. And it pretty much, I gotta tell you, it just like, after that, I never looked back. I never looked back. So I started pursuing meditation and pranayama, and I had that practice for about 3 years, really before I ever struck a pose. That's just how it worked out for me, and it was a good thing. I was going through some turbulent times as a young person then, and meditation and pranayama, the fact that that just came to me was one of the greatest things ever. It really set me on the right path. And then I started dating somebody that was getting up early in the morning doing Kabbalah body breathing, and I asked him what he was doing because I didn't really know about that breath so much, and he said, oh, I'm practicing yoga. And then I learned more about the yoga poses, and that's how it happened. So when I first got introduced to actually doing asana, well, two things happened. One, I did think it was a little weird, just because I really thought that yoga was just more about breathing and meditating. I didn't have a clue that it was about doing all this. It looked like me acrobat, on the mat, acrobatics on the mat. But then I also had a really visceral, oh, I should be doing this. And this feels really good. And when I was 19, I was living with a friend of mine. We rented an apartment together. And I would lock myself up in the room. This is a real story. I would lock myself up in a room for about 2 hours. And I had designed this I really didn't know a whole lot about practice. I was studying with Richard Hittleman on KCET, PBS, right? The 28 days. They had two girls, was the greatest thing. They had two girls, one girl with long dark hair, one girl with long blonde hair, and they were super flexible. And they wore these full-on leotards with the whole thing. And that's how I really got into practicing the asana. And it felt right, and it felt good, just like pranayama did. But it took, at first it was just a little strange. I didn't know that it was part of the tree of yoga. So how I got into restorative yoga, not necessarily how I got into it, but how it came to me, was through one of my teachers, who is now really my primary teacher. His name is Kofi, and it's hard to talk about him without feeling affected or emotional. I feel as though he has brought me the gift of life, really. And that happened to come through yoga. When I first started teaching yoga, I didn't want to teach. It was one of those situations what we've all heard before. You show up at a class, the teacher doesn't show, and everybody goes, you teach the class. Now, granted, I was the person in the back of the room, so honestly, I don't even know why I got chosen to teach, but that's kind of how it happened. And when I met Kofi, then I thought, this is the kind of teacher that I would want to be. Now I'm excited to teach. Now I really want to share this practice with everybody that is willing to listen. Restorative yoga came through him to me, really active restorative yoga, meaning that we're in poses that we're heavily propped and staying in them for longer periods of time than the classical pose, 5 or 10 breaths or something like that. And then he brought in restorative yoga to me, which was very passive. And I got yoga drunk. That's pretty much what happened. And it changed me. Again, it took me to another level in my practice. And when that happened, I decided to go through some different training programs, which I did. I went through an Iyengar training program. I studied with Donna Farhi. I had a studio for 16 years. Living in California, I had access to amazing yoga instructors, right? It was kind of the mecca of modern yoga. And so I was able to bring in, forge relationships with a lot of people and bring them into the studio. Hence, I got to practice with some amazing teachers. Still, though, to this day, Kofi is my fave. And he has inspired me to pursue what I really love in yoga, the style that I love, which is the restorative yoga. So what I love about restorative yoga and this style more than the other styles, and that's not to say that I don't love the other styles, I do. The kind of practice that I generally have is movement, some vinyasa, then holding some poses, and then restorative. And that's exactly how I teach, unless I'm teaching exclusively, restorative class exclusively. Otherwise, that's my practice. I'm always ready to get to the restorative part of that kind of a class. And I'm always ready because it's something I'm looking forward to. It feels like I can, not just find. It is the feeling that I get, which is this overall sense of who I am, who I really am. that there's a difference, right? So it's who I really am. And I love that it lays out a path for me to do that. That's why I love it so much. It lays out a path for me to find out who I really am, who I'm meant to be, the possibility of who I'm becoming. And it also sort of shows me where I was. I just don't know how that happens, honestly. I don't know why it happens. I guess it's not for me to know. And that's why I keep coming back to it. I feel like a yoga dealer right now. I feel like I'm a yoga dealer. But that's really how I feel. It feels that way to me, that I'm using it in a way to find who I am. I think that's actually probably a good thing, though. What inspires me right now in my life, and it is beginning to show up on my mat, is dwelling in possibility. I was on a trip actually up to Santa Barbara just maybe a couple of months ago, and I saw a sign that was made up of license plates, and each letter had a license plate, and it made up dwell in possibility. And it's in my yoga room at my house. And I have to admit that I haven't done that a whole lot. That I have lived a life, not risk-free, but I haven't lived a life that's like that, you know? It's been pretty measured. Even if I take a risk, it's a risk I thought about taking. It's a risk I researched. It's a risk I, really did one of these things. And I think right now in my life, what really gets me excited is dwelling in possibility. What's possible for me? Everything, anything. And my practice does help me to remember that. Actually, pranayama is what brings me there. I'm a big breather, and pranayama is probably what does that the most. Dwelling in the possibility. My yoga teacher says this about the breath. Get right with your breath, and you'll get right with death. I think it's important, I know it's important, to acknowledge Donna Farhi. She was a huge influence in my practice as well as my life. The time I have on the mat. Having a lot of Iyengar instruction behind me, very precise, very done a certain way. Donna taught me how to be open-ended in my practice. How to have open-ended relationship with my students. That's not true. What I mean is to have an open-ended conversation with my students while they're in the pose. That changed my teaching completely. From telling someone, turn your left foot in, turn your right foot out, to what would happen if you moved your foot this way, or what would happen if you let this go, or what would happen if you brought this in. I love that kind of language because it's uncertain. And that's a place where you can dwell in possibility again. It's also a place to dwell in curiosity. When I learned how to be curious about my own practice and also my students, it allowed for all of us to grow in a realm of possibility, as opposed to being set in stone. Not everybody is the same. Not everybody's body is the same. And so she really introduced this idea, even though I had all the tools in my bag of use a prop this way, use a prop that way. I also have this other piece, which is let's be curious about this. Let's see what happens. And to see a student from the eyes of curiosity was the most loving thing that I could do, I felt, for myself as a teacher. Because being present with someone is probably one of the most loving things that we can do. When someone's present with us, it's like we feel so loved, And so she brought that in, and that softened my slapping of the thighs and and all the other things that I might have done from other kinds of training that I've taken. The two together, I think, are they're me. I think it is very easy to get trapped in wanting to be a yoga star, a superstar. As a teacher, I think that there are a lot of elements in the yoga community and in the business itself that may sort of bring that out in us. And I think that I would convey, I lead these yoga teacher trainings, right, all over the country. And I can't tell you how many times people come up to me and say, well, I want to do this and I want to do that. And it's all good, it's all good that you want to do these things. Some of them actually take us away from the practice, which is sort of this weird thing, right? It's like a double-edged sword. It's like, well, I want to fulfill my passion. I want to fulfill my desire as a teacher, whatever level that is. But it might actually take us away from the principles of teaching. It might actually take us away from the heart of yoga. I find that really fascinating. So if we're paying more attention to what's out here as opposed to what we're cultivating in here, in ourselves, in our students, in the environment in which we create, we can sort of lose that stuff here. So I would say that hold lightly to your goals and hold strongly to the heart of the practice.